So last weekend I installed the Fox 2.0 longer travel. We'll say longer because they're about 2 inches longer than the OEM Sport shocks or the Rubicon shocks on here. And now I'm doing a little inspection. So one thing to note, you can see where that mud line is right there. That's how much of the shock I've been using. That's about what you want. This is a piece of rubber right here, but that's pretty good. So that means even if I really compress the bump stop, which the bump stop, you think, oh, I'm touching it, I'm good. That thing is designed to compress to at least half that, right? And this was Holopal, where I was bouncing through some stuff. So even if I fully compress the bump stop, I'm not bottoming out my shock. That's what that leads me to believe. Obviously, we're going to do a flex test now to really verify that, but that's a good sign. Everything else looks good. You can see that the RCV did sling a little bit of grease out. They say that's normal. I don't like that it slings it into the brakes, but it's staying away from the pads. You can see how it kind of looks like that. So I'm going to clean that. They recommend using Simple Green, and then I'm going to grease it. That's a grease zerk right there, and then the axle. Pretty cool. But the one problem you should see right away here is my sway bar links. So you see how the sway bar link is almost parallel with the sway bar? That means all it's doing right now is restricting travel. It's not providing any sway control. Now, obviously the weight of the truck is not on it, but the reason that happened is because I increased the length of this shock. So now I need to increase the length of this sway bar a little bit. I've decreased my up travel by 5/8 of an inch there. You can see that spacer, right? So I've decreased my up travel a little bit, so I can get away with increasing the length of my sway bar link. That'll help this stay more perpendicular, which means the sway bar will work better, and it'll also help my travel. Now, obviously, if I'm gonna be doing a lot of flexing, I'm gonna disconnect one or both sides of the sway bar. Right now, because of the way this is, I would need to disconnect both of them to get some good flex. And that's pretty obvious, right? Because even if the other side's disconnected, if this goes completely straight, it's keeping this side from dropping down all the way. Now, I'm gonna see how close that is to being at full down travel here in a second. It's pretty close. That is pretty much full down travel on the shock. I just need to measure the shock and make sure that nothing else is restricting my travel. But things you have to check when you do this are all these your brake lines, ABS sensors, are any of those tight? And you can see that they're not. So Fox is right that the sensors and everything can handle the extra down travel stock in their stock locations. There are some brackets to relocate that stuff if you ever get there. But as you can see, that's not my issue. My issue here is the sway bar links. So time to order some of those. And then the next thing after that will probably be the rear bumper, and then the front bumper. And I'm gonna get rid of some of these growths here that are designed for not running over other cars, but we don't really care about other cars here, do we? So like any good mechanic, I saw something weird, so I investigated. The symptom I noticed was that there's a lot of grease being slung around, and I wanted to make sure that if grease was coming out of the RCV, was it getting replaced with water, or was this just the break-in thing with a lot of extra grease in them, put some highway miles and it slings out? Spoke to RCV once already, said it was no big deal, but I wanted to know for myself. So here's the inside of the joint. As you can see, it's nice and greasy. There's really no indication that water is getting in here. I don't see any rust inside the joint. These are the splines that were inside there. Everything looks good. Looks like it's sealing well here, and the SST seal is sealing on the cup. However, there's not a ton of grease in here, which means that it is losing grease, but it's not letting water in. The reason it doesn't let water in is because that's a decent seal, and because grease in oil is obviously hydrophobic, so kind of pushes the water away from it a little bit. So I'm going to pack a little bit more grease in here, which is going to result in it slinging all over my wheels, which is annoying. But I think the seals are working. I just don't know if I'd recommend RCVs for a daily driver, because honestly, having grease all over your rig is kind of gross, especially on a 2021. But shaft looks okay. A little bit of rust down on this end, but where the sealing surface is, you can see the rust stops. Obviously, I got to clean this. Just came out of the truck. This is a dry shaft type axle, obviously. Not something I'm used to being a Toyota guy. So you do have a little bit of rust on there, which is kind of annoying for how expensive these axles are, but not a huge deal. The splines look good. The four-wheel drive has been engaging well and disengaging with the FAD, and everything looks good otherwise. But that's my main complaint, is the grease that's slinging out. So did a full investigation on this side. I'll be installing a new orange seal thing. I did that side because it was a little bit worse than this side, but I'm sure this side's better. And then because this one's still assembled, I'll grease it through the shaft. While I'm doing this, I'm also installing a slight upgrade. I don't know where I put it, but I'm installing some 1/2 inch spring spacers. on top of the top coil spring perch, these little guys. They're super cheap and I think they'll work well. The reason I'm doing it is because I wanted a little bit more up travel before I hit my bump stop, because I've got a longer travel shock now. And I think that's gonna help it ride a little better. Half inch doesn't sound like much, but half an inch more up travel, it means that much less abuse on your bump stop and hopefully make it ride smoother. With the longer travel shocks, I ended up with way more down travel than up travel. There's all side calculation and all that stuff, but this is just a Jeep, so we're not gonna get into all of that. But a little bit of up travel wouldn't hurt. Not really doing it for tire clearance. My tires don't rub with the way I have the spring spacer set up and the coils, the bump stop spacer, but I am doing it for function, hopefully. So it might not make a difference at all. Worst case scenario, it'll look a little cooler. One tip when you're installing this, take this and electrical tape it to the factory rubber. So it sits like this and the factory goes on the bottom. See how the little groove is? Electrical tape them together so they don't get clocked. That way they stay sitting in the groove. You do have to trim a little bit off the top of the factory rubber so it looks the height of that nipple, so it'll sit down in there flush. It's a piece of plastic, just cut it with your dikes. Pretty simple install. To install that spacer, you just unbolt the shock, unbolt the sway bar, unbolt the bracket that holds those wires so they can get a little more slack, drop the axle down, pull the spring out, put it on top, put it back in, and obviously make sure everything is aligned perfectly like you see there. Otherwise you'll have popping and binding issues with the spring. Your side flex test, no sway bars. This side's flexed down pretty good. It's crazy how good it flexes without a sway bar. Now, all right, so that's pretty damn flexed out right there. Rear tire's tucked. That shock's at full extension, and this tire's fully tucked. So that's what's cool about these Jeeps is they'll tuck a 35 pretty much stock. See, that's tucked, not rubbing anything. So now we got to check a few things. So on this side, our brake line's tight, ABS lines, nope. Shocks at full extension. At full extension, do you have a good preload on the spring? Now that I added the half-inch spacer, the spring's staying nice and tight at full down travel. That's huge. Okay, that all looks pretty good. Sturdy fenders on my Circle W trailer, supporting the weight of the Jeep. Spring's collapsing nicely. It is coil bound in that one spot, but that's why Jeep has some rubber there. And the bump stop is pretty much under full compression. There's that new SST seal. Tire's not rubbing anywhere. Obviously, if I was to turn a little bit, might get into a little bit of rubbing, but it's not too bad. So let's check the other side. Yeah, if I was to turn, I might rub like right there. Eventually, I'll probably want to do the Rubicon fenders, but that's pretty good for having it straight. And you see the shock is just about at full compression. And that tells you my bump stop is just long enough, right? You wouldn't want it to be any closer than that. That is a piece of rubber on the shock, so I'm really maximizing the full travel you can do with where my bump stops are set up. Now these shocks on a stock truck without raising the bump stops, I would not trust it. Fox says you would, but I think you might actually bottom that shock out if you don't drop your bump stops half an inch to 5/8 of an inch. Especially if you ever disconnect your sway bar and do kind of flex like this. And it's flexing to around 29 plus 30, so about probably 30 inches. If you could account for the fact that the back tire is starting to touch the ramp. All it's got that really affected travel was the front longer travel Fox shocks. It's got Gladiator Rubicon shocks rear. So this tire is on the ramp a little bit, so subtract an inch or two there, but there's still weight on that tire. And I mean, that bumper's about touching the ground, and there's still weight on this tire. So that's really good flex. This one's tucked up in there nicely, but nowhere near rubbing.
No, come back. Okay.
Driver's side flexed up. You can really see the angle the axle's got there. Pretty dang impressive. So that's one thing Jeeps will always have on Toyotas, especially in the United States where Toyota refuses to make a solid axle vehicle. A Toyota can't flex that much in the front because they just physically don't have enough travel, let alone the issues with IFS flexing. But so that shock's full down travel. That spring looks good. Nice and tight, plenty of pressure on the spring still. Fully tucked. It's a little closer to the plastic on this side, but not rubbing or anything. Tire's really digging into the fender there. You see how the suspension bushing's flexing? It's interesting. Man, everything just barely fits with all this crazy steering Duke's got on here. That bump stop is pretty freaking compressed. That's good. And we'll check the other side. I think it looks good though. Brake lines, ABS lines, nice and loose. It's good that they built us in a little bit of slack there. Yeah. Yep, that shock's about bottomed out too, so good suspension setup. No binding, nothing like that, but I can get a full flex. And the back, like I said, is still factory travel. These are factory Rubicon shocks, which don't actually increase travel. So obviously all those lines are good too. Pretty gnarly. Do a little walk around. There are some Toyotas that flex this good in the rear, with the KDSS and stuff. But there's no Toyotas that flex this good in the front, hate to say it. That is an insane amount of flex for a basically bone stock truck with just some shocks thrown on, some bump stop spacers, and 1/2-inch spring spacers. So just for everyone that doesn't know, so it's got Rubicon springs in the front, Fox 2.0, longer travel. They call it 0 to 1.5 inches of lift. It's got 1/2-inch spring spacers on top of the Rubicon springs, 5/8 bump stop spacers, homemade. The rear is stock Gladiator max toe springs and Gladiator Rubicon shocks, which are irrelevant because they're the same length as the stock ones. There's my bump stop spacers. Very ghetto. Works great. It's quite a lot of space on top of this tire. How funny is that? The weight's not on your car, Jackson.